Hi, my name is Jason Vaughn, and I am the General Counsel for the Kentucky Realtors. And I'm here today to talk to you about an agreement that we've put together in order to assist the realtors in our state in continuing to show properties, but making sure that the parties involved in the showing of that property understand what exactly they're doing, how to avoid risk, but also to release others once they agree to take on that risk. So let's talk about the agreement that we've put together. We've titled it simply a mutual agreement, release and hold harmless. And before I go forward, I want to make sure that we thank the closing attorneys in the state and the title companies and various vendors that we work with, but especially the closing attorneys who have really been on the front lines of making sure that our industry continues to move forward. They've been very helpful in helping me put this together and to work with agents to hear their concerns and to rapidly respond to their requests. So again, a shout out to them. They have really done an immaculate job, and we all, I know, appreciate it. Back to this addendum. Essentially, this is an agreement, or I say an addendum, it's really an agreement. This is an agreement between the seller, the listing agent, the listing company, the buyer, the selling agent, the selling company, and potentially anyone that comes to visit the property. As you can see from the agreement, if you look at it, it has a place for you to identify all of these parties, as well as the actual location of the property. Now, the first part is really just the seller acknowledging that there are certain risks that come from letting somebody come and view your property during the COVID-19 situation. It goes on to then say that the buyer will also acknowledge that there is a risk in coming to a property and viewing a property in light of the COVID-19 virus. And again, it also adds the selling agent and the listing agent, as well as any additional visitors that may be visiting the property. And in essence, it starts out with that general understanding. Then we give advice to each person that visits the property for purposes or related to the buyer. First of all is practice social distancing while in the property. The next one is to wear new latex-free gloves when in the property and limit any touching of the property as much as possible. Also wear face masks or face coverings as recommended by the Center for Disease Control or Prevention. Wash their hands with soap and water for 20 seconds after they leave the property. And if any visitors to the property have exhibited any potential signs of having the virus, do not enter the property until such time as the visitor's symptoms have not been present for over 14 days. Now, you may have seen other versions of this type of agreement floating out in the community, and some of them, it actually makes these situations a requirement. Now, we didn't do that and make it a requirement for one reason is because the conditions can change. But also by making it a requirement, that means that if somebody doesn't do it, they are potentially in breach of this agreement. The effect of that could be if somebody at the end ends up getting sick and they somehow find out somebody didn't do one of these preventative steps, the person that did that may potentially be subject to a lawsuit for breach of contract. So while we encourage these practices and we ask you to participate in these practices, we don't put it in there as a requirement that could subsequently create a lawsuit. Why is that important to talk about? Because you need to explain that to both the buyer and the seller or any visitors that, we're recommending this. We can't guarantee that the other parties follow these guidelines. So again, there is some risk. And the foremost thing that each of these parties can do is protect themselves, not rely on somebody else to protect them. Now, it goes on to the next part, which is things that we recommend for the seller to do. And that is to disinfect all surfaces that any visitors may have touched during the visitor's viewing of the property. And also, if the seller exhibits any potential signs of having the virus, do not allow any more visitors in the property. That just makes sense. If you think you've been sick, you don't want people coming into the area where you have potentially been sick, because that could convey the virus on to another party. Now, if you go further down, then we talk about, so we've told the parties, hey, this is important. You need to realize what's going on out there. The second part is, hey, here are some ideas and suggestions we'd like you to follow to make sure that you don't get the virus or convey the virus. And then the last part is a release, and it's a true legal release. The parties are essentially releasing the other parties. All of the other parties are releasing all of the other parties of any liability for this visit. It's important to know whether or not they follow the suggestions that we just talked about. So there is some risk involved in showing your property. They need to know that, but this is essentially saying that we are all accepting that risk, and we are not going to come and sue another party over that risk because we've been informed about it. And there's a place for each of the parties to sign: the buyers, the sellers, the listing agent, the selling agent. They will be signing on behalf of themselves and potentially their brokerage. And there's also an area that indicates that any additional visitors to the property must also sign this form. So if somebody brings an uncle or something like that, you should also have them sign this form as well. Now, this form was prepared as a benefit to realtors. That means that the only people that should be using this form, at least initially, are realtors. So what does that mean? That means that a listing agent could put it on their MLS and say, hey, anybody that wants to come into the property, they need to sign this form. My suggestion would be the listing agent gets it signed by the seller first, actually have a signed version on the MLS, and then anybody coming into the property can sign that, send it to the listing agent to show that they are in agreement, and then the listing agent could authorize the visit. That way, both parties have signed it. It's available to the buyer to look at prior to submitting it to the seller, and then the listing agent would be in possession of all the signatures once the buyer sent it, and the buyer or the selling agent would, once the selling agent sent it, and then the selling agent would also be in possession of all of the signatures. Now, again, this isn't perfect. There are different versions floating around out there, but I think it hits the main points we want. We want to inform people about the risk as we understand it. We want to suggest ways that they can avoid that risk. And then we want to create a barrier to liability, meaning essentially that we want to make sure that people are all accepting the risk, all understanding the risk, and are all waiving the responsibility of others with regard to that risk, so that we can have as safe as possible a visit and viewing of the property and hopefully a subsequent sale. Thank you.